Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. It had been 3 days since the emergency alert, the kind of alert that doesn't just buzz in your pocket or flash on your screen, it screams. It came out of nowhere, blaring through every phone, television, and radio in the city, cutting through the hum of everyday life like a knife. The message was short, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Emergency alert, zombie apocalypse. Seek shelter immediately. Do not engage. Do not trust anyone. The dead are rising. At first, people laughed. Of course they did. Zombies? Really? It had to be some kind of sick joke, a prank gone viral. Social media lit up with memes and sarcastic comments. Guess I'll cancel my brunch plans, someone tweeted. Zombie apocalypse? More like Monday morning, another quipped. But the laughter didn't last long. The first scream came from a crowded street downtown. A man, just an ordinary guy in a suit, maybe on his lunch break, suddenly dropped to the ground, convulsing. People stopped to stare, some pulling out their phones to record. Then he stood up. His eyes were milky white, his mouth twisted into a snarl. He lunged at the nearest person, biting into their neck with a wet, tearing sound. Blood sprayed across the pavement. The screams that followed weren't from the victim. They were from the crowd, scattering in every direction. It spread fast, too fast. By the time people realized it wasn't a joke, it was already too late. The dead were rising, and they weren't the slow, shambling kind you see in movies. These things were fast, vicious, and relentless. They didn't just bite, they tore people apart. And if you were bitten, you didn't die. Not right away. You turned. Within minutes, you were one of them. The city descended into chaos. Cars crashed as drivers panicked, their vehicles abandoned in the middle of the street. Storefronts were smashed as people looted for supplies. Gunfire echoed through the air, but it didn't stop the horde. Nothing did. By nightfall, the streets were littered with bodies. Some dead, some not. The lucky ones had made it to shelters, barricading themselves in basements, offices, and apartments. The unlucky ones, well, they were out there, and they weren't human anymore. 3 days later, the city was silent. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful, but the kind that makes your skin crawl. The kind where every creak, every rustle could mean something's coming for you. The emergency alert had stopped broadcasting. The power was out in most places, and the dead, they were still out there, waiting, hunting. Now, 3 days later, the city was a graveyard. The streets were empty, save for the occasional shuffling figure that wasn't quite human anymore. The air smelled like rot and smoke, and the only sounds were the distant groans of the undead and the occasional crash of glass breaking somewhere in the distance. In the midst of this chaos, a group of strangers had found each other. Or maybe they'd just been thrown together by sheer dumb luck. Either way, they were all that was left. They'd taken refuge in an abandoned high-rise apartment building, one of those places that used to be fancy but had fallen into disrepair long before the world ended. The lobby was barricaded with overturned furniture and broken glass, and the stairwells were blocked with whatever they could find: filing cabinets, mattresses, even a refrigerator someone had dragged down from the 5th floor. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could do. The group was a mismatched bunch, each carrying their own baggage, both literal and figurative. There was Maya, a single mother in her early 30s. She was thin and wiry, her face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there a week ago. She carried a small revolver, a .38 special with only 6 bullets left. She'd used one already on a man who'd tried to break into their hideout. She didn't like to think about it. Her daughter, Lily, had been torn from her arms during the initial outbreak, and Maya refused to believe she was gone. She clung to a crumpled photo of the girl, her only reminder of what she had lost. Every night, she whispered promises to the photo. "I'll find you. I swear I'll find you." Then there was Darius, a former firefighter with the kind of build that made you feel safer just being near him. He carried a fire axe and a Glock 19, though he was down to his last magazine. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was usually to bark orders or snap at someone for being careless. He had a bite mark on his forearm, hidden under a bloodied bandage. It was small, but it was there, and it was spreading. He hadn't told the others. Not yet. He wasn't ready to admit it, not to them and not to himself. Riley was the youngest of the group, a college student in her early 20s. She was lean and sharp-tongued, with a dark sense of humor that rubbed some of the others the wrong way. She wore a leather jacket that was too big for her. She'd found it in one of the apartments, and carried a crowbar she'd pried out of the building's maintenance closet. Her knack for electronics had kept the group's handheld radio working, though so far all they'd picked up was static. She didn't talk about her family or her friends or what she'd been doing when the world fell apart. She just cracked jokes and pretended she wasn't scared out of her mind. Father Thomas was the quiet one. A priest in his 50s, he had kind eyes and a weary soul. He no longer prayed, not out loud anyway, but he still carried his Bible, its pages dog-eared and stained. He didn't have any weapons, just his words and his fading faith. He'd tried to comfort the others at first, but it was hard to talk about hope when the world outside was falling apart. Still, he stayed with them, offering what little he could. And then there was Kara, a nurse in her late 30s. She was practical to a fault, her emotions locked away behind a steely exterior. She carried a medical kit and a Beretta M9 she'd taken from a dead police officer. She also had a locked briefcase, which she never let out of her sight. When asked about it, she would only say, "It's not important." But the way she held it, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, told a different story. They were an unlikely group, thrown together by desperation and circumstance. They didn't trust each other, not really, but they didn't have much of a choice. Out there in the streets, it was kill or be killed. In here, at least, they had a chance, for now. The top floor of the apartment building had become their fortress. It wasn't much, just a handful of empty units with peeling wallpaper and water stains on the ceilings, but it was the best they could do. The group had dragged every piece of furniture they could find to block the doors and windows. Couches, tables, even a heavy bookshelf that took 3 of them to move. The stairwell was barricaded with a mountain of debris. Chairs, filing cabinets, and a refrigerator someone had dragged down from the 5th floor. It wasn't pretty, but it had held so far. The problem was, they couldn't stay here forever. Supplies were running low. They'd scoured every apartment on the floor, but all they'd found were a few cans of soup, some stale crackers, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey that Riley had claimed as her own. Water was even scarcer. They'd rigged a makeshift rainwater collection system on the roof using tarps and buckets, but it hadn't rained in days. The undead were relentless, too. Every night, they could hear them downstairs, scratching at the barricades, moaning in that low, guttural way that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. One night, as the group sat in the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern, Riley tinkered with a broken radio she'd found in one of the apartments. It was an old thing with a cracked casing and a frayed antenna, but she'd been working on it for days, determined to get it working. The others watched in silence, too tired to argue. "Come on, you piece of junk," Riley muttered, twisting a knob. Static crackled from the speaker, sharp and grating. She adjusted the frequency, her fingers moving quickly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a voice broke through the noise. "This is Captain Reynolds of the U.S. Army. We have established a safe zone at the old stadium on the outskirts of the city. If you can hear this, seek shelter and await evacuation. Do not attempt to travel at night. Repeat, do not." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving the room in silence. The group stared at the radio, the weight of the message sinking in. "Did you hear that?" Riley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A safe zone. We could." "We're not going anywhere," Kara interrupted, her tone sharp. She was sitting in the corner, her briefcase clutched tightly in her lap. "It's a trap. The military's not here to save us. They're here to contain this. And if they think we're infected, they'll shoot us on sight." Maya leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But what if it's real? What if they can help us? What if my daughter's there?" "Your daughter's dead," Riley said bluntly. The words hung in the air like a slap. Maya flinched, her hands tightening around the crumpled photo she always carried. "You don't know that," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just saying, we need to be realistic," Riley shot back. "We can't risk our lives on a maybe." Father Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We should at least consider it," he said gently. If there's a chance. There's no chance, Kara snapped. You think the military's going to welcome us with open arms? They'll lock us up, or worse. We're better off here. The argument might have gone on all night if Darius hadn't stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the group. Enough, he said, his voice low and rough. We're not going anywhere tonight. We'll talk about it in the morning. The others fell silent, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Riley turned the radio off, the static fading into silence. Outside, the moans of the undead grew louder, a chilling reminder of what waited for them if they stepped outside. The argument about the safe zone had left the group fractured. Tensions simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. Maya sat in the corner, clutching the photo of her daughter, her mind racing. The radio transmission had given her a sliver of hope, but Kara's words had planted a seed of doubt. What if it was a trap? What if they walked into something worse than what they were already facing? Kara, for her part, stayed close to her briefcase, her expression unreadable. She didn't trust the military, and she didn't trust the others either. Riley leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her crowbar resting at her feet. She was tired of the arguing, tired of the fear, tired of everything. Darius paced the room, his axe slung over his shoulder, his jaw clenched. He didn't say much, but the bite on his arm was getting harder to ignore. And Father Thomas, he just looked tired. Tired of the fighting, tired of the fear, tired of trying to hold them all together. It was Thomas who broke the silence. I'm going down to the basement, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need to check our supplies. We're running low on water, and if we're going to make a decision about the safe zone, we need to know what we're working with. No one argued. They were all too exhausted to protest. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairwell, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as he descended. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and maintenance closets, most of them untouched since the outbreak. It was quiet down there, too quiet, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust. Thomas was halfway through checking the third storage room when he heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like someone trying to stifle a cough. He froze, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the far corner of the room, came a faint rustling. Thomas moved closer, his heart pounding. The beam of his flashlight landed on a small figure huddled behind a stack of boxes. It was a boy, no older than 8, with wide, terrified eyes and a stuffed rabbit clutched to his chest. He didn't speak, but the fear in his eyes was enough to make Thomas's heart ache. "It's okay," Thomas said softly, crouching down so he was at eye level with the boy. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Thomas. What's yours?" The boy hesitated, then whispered a single word. "Eli." Thomas smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, Eli, you're safe now. Come on, let's get you upstairs." When Thomas returned to the group with Eli in tow, the reaction was mixed. Maya's face lit up at the sight of the boy. She knelt down in front of him, her voice soft and gentle. "Hey there," she said, smiling despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm Maya. You're safe with us, okay?" Eli didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. He just clung to his stuffed rabbit, his eyes darting around the room. Riley, on the other hand, was less than thrilled. "Are you kidding me?" she said, throwing up her hands. "A kid? Now? We can barely take care of ourselves, and you want to add a liability to the mix?" "He's not a liability," Thomas said firmly. "He's a child. He needs our help." "And what happens when he starts crying and brings every zombie in the city down on us?" Riley shot back. "Or when he slows us down if we have to run? We can't afford dead weight, Thomas." Maya stood up, her eyes blazing. "He's not dead weight," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He's a kid. He's scared, just like the rest of us. If you have a problem with him, you can take it up with me." Riley opened her mouth to argue, but Darius stepped in before things could escalate. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We're not leaving him. End of discussion." Riley glared at him, but didn't say anything else. Kara, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "He stays," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But if he puts us at risk, we deal with it, no exceptions." The group fell silent, the weight of Kara's words hanging in the air. Eli, oblivious to the tension, clung to his stuffed rabbit, his wide eyes darting from face to face. For the first time in days, Maya felt a flicker of something other than fear. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was close. Darius had been hiding it for days. The bite on his forearm, hidden under a bloodied bandage, was getting worse. At first, he'd told himself it was nothing, just a scratch, something he could tough out. But the fever had come on fast, and now he could feel it spreading through his veins like ice, making his hands shake and his vision blur. He'd seen it happen to others. He knew what was coming. That night, as the others slept, Darius sat alone in the corner of the room, his axe resting across his knees. The lantern's dim light cast long shadows on the walls, and the sound of the undead scratching at the barricades downstairs was a constant, unnerving hum. He couldn't put it off any longer. He had to tell someone. He found Maya sitting by the window, staring out at the dark city below. She turned when she heard him approach, her eyes narrowing as she took in the look on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice low. Darius didn't answer right away. He just rolled up his sleeve, revealing the bite mark. It was angry and red, the skin around it blackened and cracked. Maya's breath caught in her throat. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 days, Darius said, his voice rough. "It's spreading, I don't have much time." Maya shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached for her revolver. "No," she said. "There has to be another way. Maybe Kara." "There's no time," Darius interrupted. "You know what happens if I turn. I'll kill all of you. I can't let that happen." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. She raised the revolver, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim. Darius didn't flinch. He just nodded, his jaw clenched. But before she could pull the trigger, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the building. The barricades downstairs had given way. The undead were inside. "Go!" Darius shouted, grabbing his axe. "Get to the roof! I'll hold them off!" Maya hesitated, but only for a second. She grabbed Eli's hand and yelled for the others to follow. The group scrambled for the stairwell, their footsteps pounding against the floor as the sound of the horde grew louder. Darius didn't look back. He charged into the hallway, his axe swinging in wide, brutal arcs. The first wave of undead fell quickly, their bodies crumpling to the floor, but there were too many of them. They just kept coming, their milky eyes fixed on him, their mouths gaping and bloody. He fought like a man possessed, his movements fueled by sheer willpower. For every one he took down, 2 more took its place. He didn't know how long he'd been fighting when he felt the first bite, a searing pain in his shoulder as one of them latched on. He roared, swinging his axe with all the strength he had left, but it was no use. They were on him now, tearing and clawing, their weight dragging him to the ground. The last thing he heard was Maya's voice, screaming his name as the group reached the roof. Then there was only darkness. The group didn't stop running until they were on the roof. The door slammed shut behind them. Maya collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. Eli clung to her, his small body trembling. Riley leaned against the railing, her crowbar still in hand, her face pale. Kara stood apart from the others, her expression unreadable. And Father Thomas, he just looked down at his hands, his lips moving in silent prayer. The sound of the horde below was deafening, but for now, they were safe. Darius's screams had stopped, but the memory of them would haunt the group for as long as they lived. The roof was no longer safe. The undead were pounding on the door, their guttural groans growing louder with every passing second. The group had to move, and they had to move fast. Riley was the first to spot the parking garage across the street, its dimly lit levels filled with abandoned cars. One of them had to work. "There!" she shouted, pointing. "We can hotwire something. Get out of here!" Maya hesitated, her eyes darting to Eli. The boy was clinging to her hand, his face pale with fear. "What if it's a trap?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if they're waiting for us down there?" "We don't have a choice," Riley snapped, "unless you want to stay here and become zombie chow." Kara stepped forward, her briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. "She's right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to move, now." The group didn't argue. They moved quickly, scaling down the fire escape on the side of the building. The streets below were eerily quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of an undead figure in the distance. They stayed low, sticking to the shadows as they made their way to the parking garage. The garage was a maze of abandoned cars, some with their doors hanging open, others covered in a thick layer of dust. Riley moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the rows of vehicles. She stopped at a Ford Explorer, its tires still intact and its keys dangling from the ignition. "This one," she said, yanking open the driver's side door. "Get in." The group piled into the SUV, Maya and Eli in the back seat, Kara and Father Thomas in the middle, and Riley behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the garage. Riley didn't waste any time. She slammed the SUV into gear and sped out of the garage, the tires screeching as they hit the street. The city was a war zone. Abandoned cars littered the roads, forcing Riley to swerve and dodge at breakneck speed. The undead were everywhere, drawn to the sound of the engine. They lunged at the SUV, their rotting hands clawing at the windows as Riley sped past. "Hold on," Riley shouted as she swerved around an overturned bus, the SUV's tires skidding on the pavement. The group clung to whatever they could, their hearts pounding as the undead closed in. Then out of nowhere, gunfire erupted. A group of looters had set up a roadblock ahead, their faces hidden behind bandanas and their weapons trained on the SUV. Riley slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a stop just feet from the barricade. "Get out of the way!" Riley shouted, leaning out the window, but the looters didn't move. One of them stepped forward, a shotgun in his hands. "Hand over the car," he said, his voice cold. "And whatever supplies you've got, then maybe we'll let you live." Maya's hand tightened around her revolver, but before she could react, Kara was already moving. She rolled down her window and fired 2 quick shots, the sound deafening in the confined space. The looter with the shotgun dropped to the ground and chaos erupted. Riley didn't wait. She slammed her foot on the gas, the SUV lurching forward as the looters scattered. Bullets pinged off the hood and one of the rear windows shattered, but they made it through. The looters' shouts faded into the distance as the SUV sped down the empty streets. When they finally reached the stadium, it was like stepping into another world. The building was surrounded by towering walls of barbed wire and sandbags, with armed soldiers patrolling the perimeter. The gates opened just long enough for the SUV to pass through, then slammed shut behind them. The group was quickly separated. Soldiers in hazmat suits escorted Maya and Eli to a holding area, their movements brisk and impersonal. Kara was taken to a separate room, her briefcase confiscated. Riley and Father Thomas were left in the SUV, their weapons taken away as they were led to a decontamination chamber. The stadium was supposed to be a safe zone, but as Maya looked around at the cold, sterile walls and the soldiers' emotionless faces, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd walked into something far more dangerous than the world outside. The stadium was nothing like they'd imagined. Instead of a sanctuary, it felt more like a prison. The walls were cold and sterile, the air thick with the smell of bleach and fear. Maya and Eli were taken to a small, windowless room where they were told to wait. The soldiers didn't explain anything. They just locked the door and left. Maya sat on the edge of a metal cot, her arm around Eli. The boy hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, but his wide eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. Maya tried to reassure him, but her own fear made it hard to sound convincing. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Meanwhile, Kara was being interrogated in another room. A soldier in a hazmat suit sat across from her, his face hidden behind a mask. He'd taken her briefcase, and now it sat on the table between them, its lock still intact. "What's in the case?" the soldier asked, his voice cold and impersonal. Kara didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Medical supplies," she said finally. "Nothing you'd be interested in." The soldier leaned forward, his gloved hands resting on the table. "We'll be the judge of that. Open it." Kara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small key. She unlocked the briefcase and opened it, revealing rows of vials filled with a clear liquid. The soldier's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked, picking up one of the vials. "An experimental serum," Kara said, her voice steady. "It was supposed to slow the infection, but it didn't work, not the way we hoped." The soldier set the vial down and stood up. "Wait here," he said before leaving the room. Kara didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, the door opened again and a man in a lab coat walked in. He was older, with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He picked up one of the vials and held it up to the light. "Fascinating," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Do you know what this could mean? If we could replicate this, we could." "It's not that simple," Kara interrupted. "The serum has side effects. It drives people insane. It's not a cure." The man in the lab coat didn't seem to care. He just smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made Kara's skin crawl. "We'll see," he said. "In the meantime, you'll be staying with us. We have a lot to discuss." Riley, meanwhile, had made a deal. She'd been taken to a separate room where a soldier had offered her a choice: cooperate or be left to fend for herself. Riley didn't hesitate. She told them about Eli, about his immunity, about how he might be the key to stopping the infection. She didn't care what happened to the others. She just wanted to survive. The soldiers didn't waste any time. They took Eli from Maya, ignoring her protests as they dragged the boy away. Maya fought back, but it was no use. The soldiers were too strong, too well trained. They locked her in the room and left her there, screaming Eli's name. Kara was the one who figured it out. She overheard two soldiers talking outside her door, their voices low but urgent. "The boy's in the lab," one of them said. "They're prepping him for dissection." Kara's blood ran cold. She had to act fast. She waited until the soldiers were distracted, then slipped out of the room and made her way to the holding area where Maya was being kept. She found Maya pacing the room, her face pale and her hands trembling. "We have to get out of here," Kara said, her voice low and urgent. "They're going to kill Eli." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She followed Kara out of the room, the two women moving quickly and quietly through the sterile halls. They found Father Thomas in a decontamination chamber, his hands bound and his face bruised. Kara freed him, and together they made their way to the lab. What they found there made Maya's stomach turn. Eli was strapped to a metal table, his small body dwarfed by the machines surrounding him. A group of scientists stood nearby, their faces hidden behind masks as they prepared their instruments. Maya didn't think, she just acted. She grabbed a scalpel from a nearby tray and charged at the nearest scientist, slashing at his arm. The man screamed, dropping the instrument he'd been holding. Kara and Father Thomas joined the fight, their movements quick and desperate. The chaos gave them the distraction they needed. Maya freed Eli from the table, her hands shaking as she undid the straps. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice was anything but steady. "I've got you." But they weren't out of danger yet. The soldiers were closing in, their weapons drawn. Father Thomas grabbed a Molotov cocktail from a nearby shelf and lit it, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Go!" he shouted, hurling the bottle at a fuel depot in the corner of the room. "I'll hold them off." The explosion was deafening, the flames spreading quickly through the lab. The soldiers scrambled to contain the fire, giving the group just enough time to escape. They ran through the burning halls, the heat and smoke making it hard to breathe. Father Thomas stayed behind, using his body to block the door and buy them time. The group made it to the parking lot, where they found a military Humvee idling near the gates, tires screeching as they hit the open road. Behind them, the stadium was in chaos. The fire had spread, and the undead were closing in, drawn by the noise and the flames. The soldiers tried to hold them off, but it was no use. The horde was too big, too relentless. As they drove away, Maya looked back at the burning stadium, her heart heavy with guilt and grief. Father Thomas was gone. Riley had betrayed them. And Eli, he was safe, but for how long? The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, they were alive. And that was enough. The farmhouse was a relic of a quieter time, its wooden walls weathered and its roof sagging in places. It stood alone in the middle of a field, surrounded by tall grass and the skeletal remains of a rusted tractor. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. Maya, Kara, and Eli had been on the road for hours, driving through the night until the Humvee's fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. They'd stumbled upon the farmhouse by chance, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The place was empty, its owners long gone, but it had food in the pantry and a well out back. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to breathe. Maya started a fire in the old stone fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Eli sat nearby, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in his arms. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the stadium, and his wide eyes seemed to stare at something only he could see. Maya tried to coax him into eating, but he just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. Kara sat by the fire, her hands resting on her knees. She'd been quiet since they'd escaped, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't or wouldn't share. The briefcase was gone, left behind in the chaos of the stadium, but the serum was still with them. She'd injected Eli with it during their escape, hoping it would protect him. Now, she wasn't so sure. "He's different," Maya said, breaking the silence. She was sitting on the floor beside Eli, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I don't know how to explain it, but he's not the same." Kara didn't answer right away. She just stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. "The serum," she said finally, her voice low. "It wasn't just supposed to slow the infection. It was designed to enhance the immune system, to make it stronger, but it wasn't tested on someone like Eli, someone who's already immune." Maya's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Kara hesitated, then stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the field was eerily still, the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. But there was something else out there, something moving in the shadows. The undead. They were gathered at the edge of the field, their milky eyes reflecting the moonlight. But they weren't attacking. They weren't even moving. They just stood there watching. "They're not coming closer," Kara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting." Maya joined her at the window, her heart pounding as she took in the sight. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their rotting forms silhouetted against the night sky. But they didn't lunge or snarl like they usually did. They just stood there, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening for something. "What's going on?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. Kara didn't answer. She just turned to look at Eli. The boy was still sitting by the fire, his back to the window. His eyes were closed, but his lips were moving, forming words too quiet to hear. And then, as if sensing their gaze, he turned to look at them. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, a pale, otherworldly light that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Kara," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" Kara didn't answer. She just stared at Eli, her mind racing with possibilities. The serum had done something to him, something they couldn't begin to understand. He wasn't just immune anymore. He was something else. Outside, the undead began to move, not toward the farmhouse, but away, their movements slow and deliberate. It was as if they were following an unseen command, their rotting bodies obeying a force they couldn't resist. Maya turned to Kara, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out of here," she said. "Now." But Kara didn't move. She just kept staring at Eli, her expression a mix of awe and dread. "It's too late," she said softly. "He's not just immune anymore. He's controlling them." Maya's heart sank as the weight of Kara's words settled over her. She looked at Eli, at the faint glow in his eyes and the small, knowing smile on his face. He wasn't the boy she'd fought so hard to protect, not anymore. And as the undead disappeared into the darkness, following some unseen command, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the world had just become a far more dangerous place. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.